Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Thursday, September 4th, 2025, and today we're talking about grass-fed versus feedlot meat, how much cold storage do you really need for a market garden, and what gives with paper mulches. So let's do it. All right, I love those covers of the theme song. That is so cool. Today's cover of the theme song was brought to you by Nick Lalonde Fogel, who, when they submitted, also sent the sheet music and said they were in Zone 5B Quebec, which I think is great context. We will put a link for Nick's work in the show notes. And musicians, please keep sending those covers of the theme song to farmermike@no-tillgrowers.com. All right, glorious Thursday to you all. I hope your first week of September is everything that you dreamed it would be. It is raining currently, and there's a pretty good chance of thunderstorms here for most of the day. So if I just randomly start weeping, know that everything is okay. I'm just very, very happy. And I just heard some thunder, so that's good. Got some spinach in the ground yesterday and really need to start more spinach and more lettuce today, because in the same way that stuff in the ground grows slower right now, so too does stuff in the greenhouse, because there's just not as much sunlight. So if I want good transplants by the end of the month, got to get going. Hi, Holly. My dog, Holly, does not like this thunder as much as I do. All right, as is the tradition of sorts on Thursdays, we try to take the day to catch up on your Patreon questions. There is now a September thread up over there at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers. So Patreon members, hit that up when you can and get your questions and or themes in. All right, our first Patreon question of the day comes to us from Benjamin Daughtry, who writes, quote, "Hey, Farmer Jesse, I'm an aspiring farmer currently living in New York City, but with plans to farm in upstate New York. A couple of years ago, my partner and I watched the movie Biggest Little Farm together, and as the credits rolled, she turned to me and said, 'Can we be farmers?' I took her seriously, and your videos were some of the first resources I found as I began educating myself about farming. I'm now a loyal listener of Growers Daily, awesome, and proud owner of the Living Soil Handbook, also awesome. Okay, here's my question. I graduated from college a few months ago, and in my last semester, I took a class called Food, Animals, and the Environment and the Outsized Environmental Impacts of Animal Agriculture. One of the key takeaways was that all animal agriculture is weighed down by an inherent inefficiency. The fact that you must feed an animal far more calories of food than you will be able to harvest from its meat. This means that the vast majority of agricultural production in the United States and all the greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impacts that come with it goes towards feeding the vast number of animal lives that we consume, and up to 90% of those calories are quote unquote wasted as the chicken, pig, cow, etc. moves its body, grows its tissues, and runs its metabolism. It would be far more efficient, resource-wise, to just eat plants. As a non-vegan, this was difficult stuff to learn, but more challenging was the realization that small-scale animal agriculture, which makes up the tiniest drop in the industrial mega system that is U.S. meat production, is actually relatively more environmentally impactful than factory farming. And listeners, don't worry, we're going to come back to all of these ideas in a minute. Anyway, they go on. I went into the class enamored with the idea that rotational grazing could save the world and reverse the climate crisis by restoring grasslands and sequestering carbon, but to my dismay, the numbers just don't bear this out. Grass-fed beef actually produces even higher carbon emissions than grain-fed, which is saying something, as beef tops all climate emission charts, because as much as it might be better for the cow to have a rumen full of grass, a grass-fed rumen actually produces more methane than a grain-fed one, and it does so for longer per pound of beef because the slower time to slaughter weight. In my opinion, there's no question that small-scale animal agriculture is better for the animal and the people who raise and consume them, but if my small farm is actually responsible for relatively more emissions than a larger one, and if a small number of people raising quote-unquote ethical meat makes people feel less queasy about consuming meat in general, even though the majority of the meat they are likely consuming comes from a factory, am I just kidding myself? Also, what are your thoughts, practices, rituals around meat consumption more generally? End quote. Okay, so interesting question here, and there's a lot to kind of go over. I could frankly spend an entire week on this subject, but I think for now it's important to add some context to some of what is put forth, and we can discuss it more over time because, well, this is a daily show and we have nothing but time. So I'm just going to try and bust this out, or myth bust this out a little bit, as it were. On the grass-fed beef actually produces even higher carbon emissions than grain-fed thing. If just looking at the cattle emissions, then maybe, sure, yeah, that makes sense because the maturation of a grass-fed cow is longer. It's going to emit more because logically it's going to live a longer life and eat a type of food, grass, that may encourage more methane. But that negates the rotational grazing benefits and carbon sequestration / cycling, water cycling, biodiversity, etc. that it creates. In fact, you talked about the energy usage. A lot of that energy is creating manure that goes into creating a healthier pasture. It also emits the emissions from the grain production itself to feed the feedlot cattle. Remember, millions of acres of the Amazon are currently being burned and destroyed so that Brazil can produce more soybeans, much of which will go to livestock. That has altered the rainfall in Brazil and will unequivocally alter the planet's hydrological cycle. It is not unreasonable to think that in our lifetime, we will see the Amazon, much of the Amazon, turn into a desert. So that's cool. Those implications of feedlots have to be factored in. Otherwise, what are we even studying here? A person who lives until they're 70 is going to use more stuff than a person who lives until 50. No argument there, but you cannot negate what those two people did in their lives. If the person who lives until 70 spent their entire life living lightly on the land, restoring ecologies, etc., and the 50-year-old spent their life just consuming, their positive or negative impacts on the world in that time will be substantially different. That said, there is some truth to the idea that grass-fed beef is not always inherently better, although the regulations allow for some fudgery in terms of if a cow is grass-fed or not in the U.S. Almost all of the grass-fed beef in America does not come from America anyway. It comes from places like Australia, where there is just more grassland and a better climate for it in some ways. So in that way, some percentage of whether or not it's better for you in terms of carbon emissions from shipping in this case, the effect on ecology, etc., depends on where it comes from as much as how it is produced. And that sort of brings us to your question about my thoughts on meat consumption generally. We do eat some meat, and the vast majority of that is locally produced on pasture. It's not 100%, and I will almost always order non-meat items when we are out to eat at places that do not have grass-fed local meats, but local grass-fed meat is a large majority of our meat consumption. I have seen rotationally grazed livestock transform landscapes with my own eyes. Remember, I did rotational grazing with sheep for years and did my apprenticeship on a farm that rotationally grazed livestock for 2 years and then worked with that farm for 2 more years after that. And so for me, when we buy meat, we like to know that it's transforming landscapes and bringing biodiversity into the mix, birds, bugs, microbes, all the things, just like I witnessed it do. Feedlots are just consumptive. They do not add, they only consume. So their only role is to take, and of course that's without getting into the nutritional side of things, of the meat or the quality of the life for the cattle themselves. So I guess I would say whether it's good or bad for the environment really will depend on the farmer and their proximity to you. I also think we need to rein in our meat consumption generally, especially because the amount of meat we eat right now would be mathematically difficult to fit on the amount of farmland that we have, especially as cities keep expanding and we are increasing our factory production here and taking farmland out of production and putting it into like server farms for AI and that sort of stuff. So that's cool. But I wouldn't let the specific concerns you laid out destroy your dream of small scale grass-fed meat production. Just be thoughtful about, how you're going to produce the meat, treat the animals, what animals make sense for you and your climate and your vegetation. Anyway, I love this question. I'm sure there will be others eager to chime in as well. So I will give you all the floor. But in the meantime, how much fridge do you actually need for a market garden, which feels like the obvious transition here? BRB.
Farmer Claire Coleman here from the Winter Growers Podcast. Did you know that I also founded Real Farmer Care, a nonprofit that supports farmer well-being? From my own experiences farming, I knew firsthand that this type of support was missing from ag, so I decided to do something about it. As of today, there are over 500 farmer recipients of a $100 self-care award, with more applying daily. If you'd like to help, each $100 donated supports one new farmer. Visit realfarmercare.com to donate and learn more. Again, that's realfarmercare.com.
All right, if you, the listener or watcher, are enjoying this podcast, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's second Patreon question comes to us from Patreon member Little Row Farms, who writes, quote, "Hey, Jesse, we are wanting to add a wash pack building to our farm, but don't want to build a permanent building due to us leasing the location. We are thinking of buying a prefabricated all-metal insulated building that we can add a cool bot room to, as well as a wash pack station. My question is, what size building do you think would be enough for a half-acre market garden that will be in heavy greens production? I want to have enough room for easy traffic flow, but not oversized due to expanse. Thanks for all you do and keep up the great content. Tyler," end quote. Okay, great stuff here, Tyler. Appreciate that. And this is one of those questions that really fits well in this podcast format. There is no world where a video called "How much cold storage space does a market garden really need" would have ever gotten enough views to justify its production. In fact, someone asked in the last video if I still do videos in the gardens, and maybe I will again at some point. But one, I do these at, 5:36 in the morning for this current one. If you're wondering why I'm kind of talking quietly, it's because the family's still asleep. But anyway, I've got a 6:30 interview to get ready for. So I do these early, and that enables me to actually do them. And two, I've done basically every video I can do that way. That will, earn enough views to make the money that we need to make to keep this thing going. Some of them I've done twice over, in fact. So there really isn't anything more for me to do in that format. I've covered the bigger stuff at this point. This podcast kind of enables me to cover some of the smaller stuff. So that's fun. So yeah, get as many of these sort of nuanced questions in as you all have, Patreon members. Podcast for the win. All right, so there are two main considerations here, space and mobility. The mobility/impermanence element of the structure itself will make some of this decision for you. For instance, you've mentioned a prefab building, and that's fine, but would it be better than, say, a shipping container that a truck can drop off and then later come pick up and take to the next farm, or perhaps a trailer? Looking at those may help make the decision for you to some extent. For size, for me on the cold storage side, I could arbitrarily say that a 1 8x8 by 9 foot space like we have will do it for you on that acreage. That works for us for the most part on about 3/4 of an acre, though it definitely gets really tight when this farm is in full production. We have another fridge though that we can bail us out if need be. But honestly, this is really just a math problem in terms of the cold storage. Look at the bins you are hoping to use and measure them for the cubic feet that they take up, length times width times height of the outside dimensions. For me, I would suggest aiming to account for at least 1/3 of the number of beds being harvested at a time. So basically, you're going to be harvesting 1/3 of your beds every time you're harvesting. So if you factor that you will need at least 3 bins per harvested bed, and each bin takes up 7 cubic feet, which I'm just completely making all this up, you will have to do your own measurements. And you have, say, 25 beds to follow, you would need 175 cubic feet available per harvest. You don't have to follow along with these numbers, but I'm just trying to give you some context and some examples. But that's like a 5.5 times 5.5 times 5.5 foot space, or however you want to configure those dimensions. Now, whatever number you come up with here is not the size that you need. Remember, you've only harvested 1/3 of your farm, so that number is the kind of the absolute bare minimum, but it gives you a starting point to know what you have to make sure that stuff stays relatively cold. Some growers can get away with just using a fridge or two, though I will say that a CoolBot, a tool that modifies the AC unit to be a cool air compressor, and an insulated room is often cheaper than a nice fridge, or at least a couple nice fridges. So anyway, for me, that's where I would start. Just sit down and math it out. But of course, don't use my numbers. Those are just completely made up. But you can still use that formula for finding the cubic feet of the bins, and then work backwards to figure out what the cubic space of the storage would be. As for the amount of space you actually need for moving around and mobility and stuff, I've talked a little bit about what you would need in terms of a wash pack station, what you'd want to use for your wash station, what you'd want to use for dunking. So a lot of that, if you're doing greens, you're going to need to figure out what you're going to be using in terms of the tubs themselves. And you will want at least a few tables for setting stuff. So we have 3 stainless steel tables. I think they are all 6 by 3 feet or whatever width a typical stainless steel table comes in. And then I want to have at least 4 feet behind me if I'm placing them parallel to one another. And then that way I can turn around, take the bin off the table, put it in the wash tub, run it through the wash line, and then move on. Just measure all the things, like how big is your wash tub, how, what size is the spinner going to be. You're going to need a pack table. So you just need to measure all of those things and what you can afford, and then that will give you how much space. It's always just a basic math problem. And make sure that space is covered if you can. It's okay if it's outdoors, like a lot of our space, our wash back station is outdoors, but sometimes it's raining, not often enough, but sometimes. And in that case, you just want to stay out of the rain, even if you're washing something. It's not fun to stand in the rain and have to wash carrots, for instance. It's a lot of water. Anyway, I hope something in there was helpful. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will discuss paper mulches. But first, a quick word from our friends at Rimmel Greenhouses. Whether you're growing tomatoes for market, flowers in the spring, or vegetables for your family, growing in a high tunnel protected from the weather provides the right environment for a harvest you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouse systems are strong and durable and easy to assemble, offering the quality you need to grow productively year-round. Also, greenhouses and high tunnels do make a good wash pack station, so just keep that in mind. We have friends that do that. The team of experts at Rimmel Greenhouse Systems will be your trusted partners to ensure you get exceptional value from your greenhouse or high tunnel investment. Visit Rimmel.com today to get growing.
All right, if you're watching on YouTube, this pile of leaves, I got it super wet and then I had a tarp over it. And you can see when you pull the top layer of leaves back that you just get the most beautiful leaf mold. So it takes almost a year, but you get a really, really nice amount of that stuff. Awesome.
All right, our third and final Patreon question of the day comes to us from Jert Sampson, who writes, quote, "Hi, Farmer Jesse. Greetings from Zone 4, Vermont. I'm curious if you or any of our listeners have used any paper mulch products. Looks like there are quite a few options out there right now. I'm trying to reduce plastic usage and need to find something to help with weed suppression. You mentioned burlap. I like the idea, but that gets pricey quickly, even in my context of a large home garden/homestead. Do you know of a good source of cheap or repurposed burlap? I may give paper a try next year in a plot of squash and on the onion plot. I love growing onions, but what a pain it is to keep them weeded. Thanks," end quote. Yeah, onions can be a pain. Hear that? All right, great question here. So I have not tried all the paper mulches out there, and as far as I know, only a handful are technically allowed in organic production. We used to use one called Weed Guard Plus, which is OMRI listed, essentially meaning that it is allowed in organic production. There are a couple others like Gardn paper, Gardn paper, not OMRI listed notably, and Sunshine paper, which is listed. Then, of course, some people just use recycled craft paper. Now, the organic rule here is essentially that producers are allowed to use things like newspapers and other recycled paper that does not have gloss or glossy inks or colored inks of any sort. So as long as it is blank and recycled, if you are wanting to certify, it should be in the realm of okayness, though I always recommend double checking with your certifier before using any product on your garden. Anyway, if you're not organic, I would still avoid the inks and such, and for that matter, newspapers, magazines, etc. All right, so for using paper mulch, for me, it does not make a great mulch on its own. I consider paper mulches to be somewhat of a supplementary mulch. The reason for that is it's really just wind. Wind will rip even the good paper mulches in half and throw them in your face, sometimes literally. What happens is, even if you have the sides pinned down well, like it covered in soil or covered in, like wood chips from the pathways or whatever, if any wind can get into the planting hole, the mulch will be easily compromised. Now, there are some thick ones that may work better, and you can add compost or soil around the planting hole to prevent the wind from getting underneath it. But that extra work, and not to mention the extra soil work, may not be worth it. For me, I like paper mulches as a weed barrier beneath my main mulches, especially when looking to start new gardens without tillage, like on a pasture. So in that scenario, you would lay the paper mulch down and then whatever other mulch, compost, hay, etc. that you want over top. What some growers will do with the paper mulch is to do a heavy tillage event and then lay the mulch down and then cover the sides, just to lock it in place. But then you are battling weeds along the edges, and not to mention it could still, the paper mulch itself could still rip in the planting holes. Anyway, paper mulch just as a straight mulch on its own is not usually my preference or recommendation, but others can feel free to chime in with their experience using it, in which products that worked for them. As for your question about finding cheap burlap, that I'm not so sure about, but the difference is longevity. Unlike the paper mulch, you should be able to reuse that burlap several times. That said, I have not played around with it really, but I do plan to next year, so I will keep you all updated on that. I like the idea of a product like burlap. I also like the idea of getting away from plastics. Paper mulch, though, is a tough one only because it's inherently flimsy. Okay, well, I hope that was at least a little bit helpful in anything I talked about today, and otherwise, we're going to call it a Thursday. Don't forget, No-Till Growers is now officially a nonprofit 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. You can learn more about how to do that in the show notes. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow wherever you're getting this podcast. That's an easy way to help us out. An enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. And if you'd ever like to sponsor the show, you can reach out to Farmer Michelle at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a hat like this one or a copy of my book, The Living Soul Handbook, at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of September, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Jen. Oh, I had a friend named Jen, probably the same one. Joe Haggerty, Jacob Schwab, and Kim Meyer. Shouts to you all. All right, so as you will remember, Pat, our hiker friend, has gone on a hike and found a new trail they had never taken before. And like any good participant in a fictional story, they have gone down said path. It's a thin trail, clearly made by deer or something, but there is just something relieving about it. It's smell, it's the coolness of the air, the quietness. It's everything that got Pat into hiking in the first place. Then, however, about half an hour into this hike, Pat decides, it's time to turn back because it's the fall and it's getting dark, and turns around only to see that the trail is completely gone behind them. Suddenly, a panic sort of sets in. Pat does not recognize this part of the forest. A chill is kind of taking over the air. The city is not really visible from this vantage. In effect, an experienced hiker has made a rookie mistake. Suddenly, just like that, an alarm goes off, and Pat wakes up in bed. Is that a dream? Pat has no recollection of coming home. But the clock says 8 a.m. Pat sits up, looks at the calendar. It's Friday, which doesn't make any sense because it was already Friday. Friday again? What happened? Well, that is for tomorrow on The Unbeaten Path. Yeah, it's all right. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Everything from clothing to household items are getting more expensive each day. The world of fast fashion has complicated clothing production by outsourcing around the world to whoever can sew them the cheapest. And now you, the consumer, are paying the price with rising costs. American Giant is about keeping things simple and close to home. They aren't affected by tariffs because their products never leave the U.S. So when you buy from American Giant, you're taking a stand for hardworking people, local communities, and quality clothes. American Giant directly supports American manufacturers and ensures you aren't footing that tariff bill. Support American-made, tariff-free clothing with American Giant. Get 20% off your first order when you use promo code STAPLE20 at American-Giant.com. That's 20% off when you use code STAPLE20 at American-Giant.com.